There's technically two different types of reverb. There's plate reverb and then there's spring reverb. Hey, what up y'all? Mr. Cruz here, your friendly neighborhood producer, back with another video. And in today's video, we're gonna be taking a look at Arturia's Rev Spring-636 reverb. Let's go. So Rev Spring-636 is a spring reverb. There's technically two different types of reverb. There's plate reverb and then there's spring reverb. What comes to mind when you think of a reverb sound is really a plate reverb. This one is different because this is a spring reverb. Now the reason they called it a spring reverb is, I don't want to get like super technical into all this stuff, but they essentially used to have this box that the audio signal would travel through. And if I'm not mistaken, it was a metal box. Inside that box, they had a spring or a coil inside. The audio signal would travel through the coil, and then the sound that would emanate from the end of that coil is what was picked up, and then that kind of came to be spring reverb. But let's go ahead and take a deep dive into Arturia's Rev Spring-636. Before we get into it, of course, you know I'm going to go over some of these parameters here, but I wanted to go over the signal flow because the signal flow on this one is pretty unique. So initially you have these two buttons where you can kind of determine the input type, whether it's mic or aux. I have found that the aux tends to sound better, but you can kind of get different sounds, so we'll kind of test that out. And then we have our input knob. Now our input knob isn't just like any typical input knob. This input knob actually will add distortion to your signal. So if you don't want any distortion, you're going to kind of set it to default. But if you turn up that input signal, you are going to add distortion into it. So again, for our signal flow is going to go from our mic or our aux in to our input, and then it's going to go straight to down here under the advanced tab. Right, if you click the advanced tab, you open up this little bottom section. It's going to go through the pre-delay, the pre-filter, and the tank. I don't want to get too far into it, but a pre-delay pretty much determines how like close or far away the initial sound is going to be perceived. And then of course we have our pre-filter. If you click here, you can select a low pass, band pass, or a high pass filter, and you got different variations depending on what kind of slope you want. And then you can also control the resonance. And then we have tank. Remember what I mentioned in the beginning, that spring reverb was birthed out of coils or springs that were loaded inside of a box. The tank buttons right here, the tank control, I swear, if anybody's ever played like the old school Resident Evil games, like every time I say tank controls, that's what I'm thinking of.
Resident Evil.
Clicking different tank buttons will actually change or it'll emulate the difference in the materials that were housing the coils or the springs. A metal one might sound different than an iron one, or it might sound different than a cobalt. I don't know. It's like a whole bunch of different styles and materials that were used in order to create spring reverb early on. So from here, our signal is going to go to decay, and then this is kind of where things start to get fun. Now again, spring reverb, it's very different than plate reverb, and you'll kind of get a sense of it here, but I tend to use spring reverb when I want a much shorter decay time. I usually don't like it with a long decay because you end up getting real resonancy, tingy, springy sounds. And sometimes I don't want that. So then from decay, it's going to go down here to our post EQ. And then from our post EQ, it goes back up here to our width. And here with our post EQ, you really pretty much have like a 3-band EQ where you can control the high pass filter, the low pass filter, and just some basic EQing in like a band pass or a band EQ in the center. And then you have your blend knob, and lastly you also have your output. And this little button right here is our link knob. Whenever this is enabled or selected, you'll know that it's selected or enabled when that line is horizontal. Whenever you move your input knob, it's going to adjust the output knob accordingly. So it's almost like an auto gain feature in a way, without it actually being an auto gain. All that aside, let's go ahead and jump into it and see how this sounds. So let's go ahead and take a listen to this beat without any spring reverb on it. So let's mess around with some of this. I'm gonna set this back to default where I initially had it, to reset everything. Even though with the default setting, you are gonna get some reverb. Let's go ahead and turn this all the way to dry. And yeah, let's go ahead and work on something here. Let's first mess around with our two different input knobs. Like you can kind of already tell, like this right here, all on its own, straight up lifeless. This one with it, gives it a little bit more depth and almost gives it like a very eerie haunted house kind of feel. I'm digging it. Like I had said before, I tend to not really use a lot of spring reverb because I'm not a big fan of like that high-pitched resonancy kind of sound. This one slightly changed my opinion on it. I did feel like I found some good pockets of where the sound was coming in really nicely, but was also airy without being too high-pitched and like ringy. If I ever come across using a spring reverb, like I would have to have a very specific sound that I'm going for that is maybe like intentionally overmodulated. I would definitely reach for something like this. Overall, probably not my favorite plugin that's included as part of the collection, but again, that collection comes with like 22 plugins. And out of those 22, we've gone over like 4 or 5 of them, and all 4 or 5 of those have been like straight up winners. I wasn't a fan of spring reverb before. That has changed very little after using this. If you guys would like to check out any of the other Arturia plugins that we've reviewed, go ahead and click this video right here. Outside of that, it's your boy Mr. Cruz. Out.